The wheat had gone to seed 3 seasons running, and the bank letters came weekly now, each one thinner than the last, as if the paper itself knew there was nothing left to say. Marlo Dennison stood at the edge of the airstrip she'd poured with her own hands 12 years ago, watching heat shimmer rise from asphalt that shouldn't exist this far into Kansas cattle country. Her neighbors called it a waste of good pasture. Her ex-husband called it a monument to stubbornness. The county assessor called it taxable property she could no longer afford. But on certain nights, when the wind came from the east and carried the smell of distant rain, Marlo called it the only thing she'd ever built that couldn't disappoint her. Tonight the wind was still. The sky had that particular quality of darkness that comes before moonrise, when stars punch through the atmosphere with unusual clarity, and the horizon becomes a suggestion rather than a certainty. She was walking the runway with a flashlight, checking for the cracks that appeared each spring like prophecies of structural failure, when she heard it. Not the sound itself, but the absence of sound where sound should be. A pressure change in the air. A subtle displacement of atmosphere that made her spine straighten with muscle memory from another life. She killed the flashlight, stood motionless in the center of the runway, listening with an attention that most people reserve for loved ones or predators. 30 seconds passed. Then she saw it, a darkness against darkness, a shape that blotted out stars in a pattern she recognized from 1,000 approaches in a different country under different circumstances. The C-130 Hercules came in without navigation lights, without landing lights, without any acknowledgement that federal aviation regulations existed or mattered. The pilot was good, she noted with the clinical detachment of someone who'd once been better. The approach angle was steep but controlled, the airspeed managed with the kind of precision that suggested either military training or profound desperation. Possibly both. The main gear touched asphalt with barely a chirp of rubber. Thrust reversers engaged with a muted roar that seemed impossibly quiet for an aircraft that size. By the time the plane rolled to a stop at the far end of her runway, Marlo had already counted the seconds, calculated the fuel load from the approach speed, and identified at least 3 federal laws being violated in her front yard. She should call the sheriff. She should run to the house and lock the doors and pretend she'd seen nothing. Instead, she started walking toward the dark aircraft, her flashlight hanging loose at her side, unused. Some part of her that hadn't spoken in years was suddenly, terrifyingly awake. The cargo ramp began to lower before the engines fully spooled down. No interior lights, no voices, just the hydraulic whine of military hardware performing its designed function in absolute darkness. Marlo stopped 50 feet away, close enough to see but far enough to run if running became the intelligent option. A figure appeared in the cargo bay, silhouetted against a darkness somehow deeper than the night around it. Marlo Dennison. The voice was male, professional, and carried the particular accent of someone who'd spent years disguising where they were actually from. She didn't answer immediately. Let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for whoever was standing in her field at midnight without invitation or explanation. Finally, "That airstrip is private property. You're trespassing." The figure stepped down the ramp, not rushing but not hesitant either. "We know. We're also aware you've got a foreclosure hearing in 9 days and approximately $14,000 in back taxes. That's why we're here." Marlo's hand tightened on the flashlight. "I don't do business with people who won't show their faces." A second figure emerged from the cargo bay, smaller, moving with the efficient grace of someone comfortable in tactical situations. This one stepped into the ambient starlight, revealing a woman perhaps 10 years younger than Marlo, wearing civilian clothes that fit like they'd been selected by a procurement officer. "My name's not important. What's important is that we have a contract opportunity that pays $200,000 for approximately 6 weeks of work. The job requires someone with your specific qualifications who also happens to own an unlisted airstrip in the middle of nowhere that's about to be seized by federal authorities anyway." The younger woman's smile was thin. "You could say we're offering you a severance package from a career the Air Force ended prematurely." Marlowe felt something cold settle in her chest. How do you know about that? We know about Kandahar. We know about the court-martial that became a medical discharge that became a sealed file that ruined your life anyway. We know your call sign was widow before they took your wings. The woman took another step forward. We also know you were right, and they were wrong. And 23 Marines are alive today because you disobeyed a direct order from someone who'd never seen combat and couldn't read weather patterns to save his life. Literally. The wheat rustled in a sudden gust that came from nowhere and returned there just as quickly. Marlowe's jaw tightened. That night in Kandahar was 9 years behind her, buried under medication and therapy and the daily work of pretending she'd moved on. "What's the job?" she asked, because asking was easier than remembering. The man who'd spoken first descended the ramp now, carrying a tablet that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Reconnaissance flights over domestic territory. Low altitude, terrain following, instruments only. You'll be flying routes that don't officially exist over areas that aren't supposed to be monitored. No weapons, no cargo, no passengers except a systems operator will provide. You fly where we tell you when we tell you, and you don't ask questions about what the equipment is recording. That's illegal surveillance." "It's complicated surveillance," the woman corrected. "And it's voluntary. You can say no, keep your integrity, and lose your land in 9 days. Or you can say yes, keep your land, and spend 6 weeks doing what you were born to do before bureaucracy decided competence was less important than protocol." Marlowe looked past them at the C-130, its turboprops still ticking as they cooled, the whole aircraft radiating the particular menace of military hardware in civilian spaces. She thought about the bank letters, the silence of the house behind her, the way her hand still automatically twitched through pre-flight procedures whenever she heard aircraft overhead. "Who do you work for?" she asked. The woman's expression didn't change. "People who still believe you were the best combat pilot of your generation. People who think the Air Force made a mistake when they grounded you. People who occasionally need things done that can't be done through official channels. IA, among others." The tablet screen brightened slightly as the man swiped through documents. "The contract is straightforward. 6 weeks, $200,000 paid in cryptocurrency to accounts will establish for you. The aircraft is a modified King Air 350, equipped with sensor packages you don't need to understand. Your job is to fly the routes precisely as programmed, maintain altitude within 5 feet, and bring the plane back intact." He turned the tablet toward her. "If you're interested, we need an answer in the next 5 minutes. The people we're watching don't keep regular hours." Marlowe stared at the glowing screen without reading what it displayed. 9 years since she'd flown anything more complex than a crop duster. 9 years since she'd felt the particular clarity that came from trusting instruments in weather that wanted to kill her. 9 years since she'd been called widow, the call sign that started as mockery and ended as something closer to prophecy. "I want 50% up front," she heard herself say. "In cash, not cryptocurrency. And I want the contract to include a clause that if anything goes wrong, if this turns out to be something other than what you're describing, I walk away clean with no legal consequences." The woman laughed, a short bark of sound that held no humor. "You're not in a position to negotiate. Then you're not in a position to need me specifically," Marlowe countered. "There are 100 washed-up military pilots between here and Denver, but you came to my runway, to my foreclosure, with information about my sealed military records, which means there's something about me specifically that you need. So I'll ask again, 50% up front, legal immunity clause, or you can spin up those engines and find another pilot." The silence that followed felt different than before, calculating rather than threatening. Finally, the man nodded slowly. 40% up front. Immunity clause limited to actions taken while following our explicit instructions. Any deviation from the flight plans, any unauthorized communication, any attempt to investigate or document what you're doing beyond the flying itself, and the immunity disappears. "Deal?" Marlowe extended her hand. Neither of them took it. We'll wire 40,000 to your bank account within the hour. The remaining 160 comes on successful completion. You'll receive flight plans by secure message 24 hours before each mission. The King Air will be delivered here tomorrow at dawn. Your systems operator will arrive with the aircraft. I work alone, Marlowe said. The woman's expression finally shifted, revealing something that might have been sympathy or might have been contempt. Not on this you don't. The equipment requires a specialist, and honestly, after 9 years of flying fertilizer runs over corn fields, you're going to need someone watching the instruments while you remember how to navigate at 200 feet doing 300 knots. The words stung because they were probably true. Marlowe's pride wanted to argue, but her bank account encouraged silence. Fine, but I'm pilot in command. Anyone who doesn't like my decisions can find another ride. Agreed. The man tapped his tablet and the screen went dark. One more thing. You'll be flying under visual flight rules but through instrument conditions. Most of your missions will be at night, following terrain in areas without radar coverage, maintaining radio silence except for emergencies. It's the kind of flying that killed a lot of pilots back when you were still in uniform. That's why you're paying me 200,000 instead of 50. Marlowe met his eyes directly. That's why we're paying you, he agreed. Welcome back to operational flying, Captain Dennison. Try not to auger into a mountain on your first week. They walked back up the ramp without further conversation. The hydraulics whined again, raising the cargo door, sealing them back into their traveling darkness. The engine spun up with practiced efficiency. Marlowe retreated to the edge of the runway, watching as the C-130 began its takeoff roll, still without lights, still without acknowledgement of the normal world where aircraft announced themselves and followed rules designed to prevent mid-air collisions. The transport rotated and climbed into the darkness, its silhouette visible only as an absence of stars, and then it was gone as completely as if it had never existed at all. Marlowe stood alone on her runway, flashlight hanging forgotten at her side, listening to the whisper of wheat in the darkness and the thunder of her own heartbeat. She just agreed to something that would either save her land or end her freedom. Possibly both, probably neither. She walked back to the house through darkness that felt different now, charged with possibility or consequence. The bank letters were still stacked on her kitchen table, each one a small monument to failure. In her bedroom, she stood before the closet where she'd stored her flight gear 9 years ago, buried under winter coats and boxes of tax returns. The helmet was still there, scuffed and scarred from Kandahar dust, her call sign painted on the side in letters that had faded but not disappeared. Widow. They'd given it to her after the first month, when 3 pilots in her squadron died in the span of 10 days, and everyone started looking at her sideways, like proximity to her was epidemiologically dangerous. She kept flying, kept bringing her aircraft home, kept watching other people's funerals from the back row, standing at attention while taps played and flag-draped coffins loaded into transports bound for Dover. The call sign stuck. Then the night in Kandahar happened, when she'd refused a direct order because the weather was wrong and the intelligence was wrong, and sending helicopters into that valley was tactically stupid and morally indefensible. She'd been right. The helicopters would have crashed. 23 Marines would have died. But she'd broken the chain of command, contradicted a superior officer, and created a political problem that required resolution. Medical discharge for persistent anxiety. Sealed records. The kind of ending that looked clean on paper and ruined lives in practice. She set the helmet on her bed and stared at it in the darkness, wondering if she was about to make the same mistake again, or finally correct it. The wire transfer appeared in her bank account at 2:17 in the morning, exactly as promised. $40,000, source listed as consulting services from a company she'd never heard of. Marlowe sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone screen, watching the numbers that represented 6 months of mortgage payments and enough runway to figure out what came next. If she was smart, she'd return the money, contact the FBI, report the whole bizarre encounter. She was careful. She'd hire a lawyer, document everything, build a case for plausible deniability. Instead, she made coffee and waited for dawn, wondering what kind of aircraft she'd be flying and who exactly she'd be watching. The King Air arrived as the sun broke the horizon, materializing from the east like a rumor solidifying into fact. It was beautiful in the way that functional things are beautiful, all purpose and precision with none of the aesthetic compromises that civilian aircraft required. Matte paint in nondescript gray. No registration numbers visible from the ground. Sensor pods under the wings that looked like external fuel tanks but weren't. The landing was professional, economical, exactly what Marlowe would have done if she were trying to make an impression without seeming to try. The pilot shut down on the ramp and emerged from the cockpit with the casual confidence of someone who knew they were good and didn't need to announce it. Male, early 40s, wearing a flight suit with no patches, no name tape, no indication of service or allegiance. He nodded to Marlowe and started his post-flight inspection without speaking. The right side door opened, and a second figure climbed out, smaller, moving with the careful precision of someone carrying equipment that didn't respond well to impacts. This one wore civilian clothes, cargo pants and a technical jacket, but the posture screamed military background. Marlowe walked toward the aircraft, studying the modifications that covered it like tactical acne. Satellite communications dome on top of the fuselage. Additional antennas along the spine. What looked like FLIR turrets in the nose and tail. This wasn't reconnaissance equipment. This was the kind of hardware that built targeting packages and compiled evidence for operations that never made the news. Captain Dennison, the system's operator, approached with an extended hand. I'm Kai. No last name, no small talk, no interest in your story beyond whether you can fly instruments in weather that would ground anyone sensible. The handshake was firm, professional, the kind that communicated competence without dominance. Up close, Kai was maybe 30, with the kind of weathered face that came from time in bad places under worse circumstances. Asian features, no accent, eyes that tracked movement with the constant vigilance of someone who'd learned that inattention kills. Can you keep up with terrain following navigation at night without instruments? Marlowe asked. Can you fly terrain following routes at night without killing us both? Kai countered. They stared at each other for a moment, then simultaneously smiled. It was going to be an interesting 6 weeks. The silent pilot finished his inspection, nodded once to Kai, and walked toward a black SUV that had appeared at the edge of the property while Marlowe was focused on the aircraft. He drove away without fanfare, leaving the King Air sitting on the ramp like an orphaned child of dubious parentage. He doesn't talk much, Kai observed. Seems like a theme with you people, Marlowe replied. She circled the aircraft, running hands along surfaces, checking control linkages, looking for the small signs of maintenance quality that separated professional operations from accidents waiting to happen. The King Air was immaculate. Someone was spending serious money to keep this hardware operational. We fly the first mission tonight, Kai said, pulling a tablet from a shoulder bag. Routing will upload to the flight management system 2 hours before departure. You'll have 30 minutes to review, file a fake VFR flight plan to a fake destination. Then we launch and fly the real route under radio silence. What are we looking for? You're flying, I'm looking. That's how the division of labor works. Kai's expression was neutral. You worried about the legality. I'm worried about the stupidity, Marlowe corrected. Illegal I can work with. Stupid gets people killed. Fair. Kai climbed back into the aircraft, gesturing for Marlowe to follow. The cabin had been stripped of passenger accommodations and replaced with equipment racks that looked like they belonged in a server room. Displays covered every available surface. Cooling fans hummed with the sound of serious electrical consumption. Whatever they were recording, it required processing power that belonged in intelligence fusion centers, not private aircraft. I'm going to ask you a direct question, Marlowe said. And I want a direct answer. Are we targeting Americans? Kai looked up from the equipment rack, and for the first time something like respect crossed those carefully neutral features. Yes. But not the Americans you're worried about. We're tracking supply chains, financial transfers, and communication patterns for networks that exploit legal ambiguity to do things that are unquestionably harmful. drug trafficking that hides behind state cannabis legalization, money laundering that exploits cryptocurrency exchanges, human trafficking that disguises itself as labor contracting. She paused. It's still surveillance. It's still probably illegal depending on which lawyer you ask. But it's not political. It's not targeting activists or journalists. And it's not the kind of thing that ends with innocent people in secret prisons. How do I know you're telling the truth? You don't, Kai admitted. But you needed $40,000 9 hours ago, and now you have it. You needed a reason to believe you're still a pilot instead of a farmer who's failing at farming. Now you have that too. Whether I'm lying about our targets is honestly less important than whether you can fly this aircraft at 200 feet over the Ozarks without radar altimeter support, because that's what's going to kill you if anything does. Marlowe studied the equipment racks, the displays, the modifications that represented millions in black budget funding. I want to see the route before I agree to fly it. No. Then find another pilot. I said no routes in advance, not no routes at all. Kai pulled up a display showing a topographic map. You get the full routing 2 hours before departure, like I said. But I'll tell you now that tonight's mission is approximately 4 hours long, maintains minimum altitude of 500 feet above terrain, and includes 3 extended segments below 1,000 feet. There are sections through mountainous terrain, sections following river valleys, and one particularly exciting stretch through the Ouachita National Forest where you'll be navigating by pure dead reckoning because there's no GPS, no radio, and no ground references except trees that all look identical in infrared. Marlowe felt something unfamiliar uncoil in her chest. Not fear exactly, but its close cousin, anticipation. The kind of electric nervousness that preceded complex missions in Afghanistan, when the stakes were high and the margins were thin and being alive at the end felt like winning. I'll need an hour in the aircraft before we launch. Familiarization, system checks, emergency procedures. You'll have 90 minutes, Kai agreed. Use them well. Our window opens at 2200 and closes at 2230. If we're not airborne by then, the mission scrubs and we try again tomorrow. What happens if we miss multiple windows? Kai's smile was thin. Then the people who decided you were worth $200,000 realize they made a mistake. You don't get paid and your foreclosure proceeds as scheduled. But honestly, missing windows is the least of your problems. The flying is going to be harder than anything you've done since Kandahar. The difference is that this time, no one's shooting at you. Just gravity, weather, and your own limitations. Marlowe climbed into the left seat, running her hands over controls that were familiar but not identical to the aircraft she'd flown years ago. The panel was modified, stripped of unnecessary civilian instruments, and upgraded with military-grade navigation and communication equipment. The flight management system looked like it had been borrowed from a C-17. The heads-up display was pure fighter aircraft technology, projecting flight data directly onto the windscreen in green lines that seemed to float in space. This was not a standard King Air. This was a purpose-built reconnaissance platform masquerading as civilian hardware. One more question, Marlowe said. The people we're watching, are they dangerous? Everyone's dangerous if you get close enough, Kai replied. But we're not getting close. We're staying airborne, maintaining separation and collecting data that other people will use to build cases that might eventually lead to arrests. You're a sensor platform, not an operator. Remember that and you'll be fine. Marlowe wanted to ask more, but Kai had already moved to the equipment racks, beginning startup procedures that filled the cabin with electronic chatter and cooling fan noise. The conversation was over. Tonight she'd be flying again, really flying. The kind that required every bit of skill and attention she possessed. The kind that made her feel alive in ways that no amount of therapy or medication had managed to replicate. She spent the next 6 hours reviewing the King Air Systems manual, committing emergency procedures to memory, and trying not to think about all the ways this could end badly. The flight plan uploaded at 8 o'clock exactly, appearing on the tablet Kai had provided with the kind of precision that suggested automation rather than human timing. Marlowe studied the route with growing concern. They'd be launching to the southeast, climbing initially to 12,000 feet, then descending into terrain that got progressively more complex. The low-altitude segments followed river valleys and ridge lines with minimal clearance, weaving through areas where a navigation error of half a mile would put them into terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. It was aggressive flying, the kind that required constant attention and absolute precision, the kind she hadn't attempted in 9 years. "You're frowning," Kai observed from the right seat. "I'm calculating survival probability," Marlowe replied. "What are we at?" 85% if the weather holds, 60% if it doesn't." Kai nodded as if this was acceptable. "The weather will hold. We've got satellite data updated every 6 minutes. If conditions deteriorate, we scrub. Simple." Nothing about this was simple, but Marlowe didn't argue. She filed the fake flight plan, citing a VFR training flight to Tulsa with an estimated return in 4 hours. The controller at Kansas City Center accepted it without comment, probably assuming she was building hours for an insurance requirement. At 9:45, she began the pre-flight inspection in darkness, using a red flashlight that preserved night vision while revealing the aircraft's secrets. Oil levels good. Fuel quantity matching the flight plan requirements. Control surfaces free and correct. Tires properly inflated. All the small rituals that separated professional pilots from corpses. Kai watched from the cabin door, saying nothing, judging everything. At 10:15, Marlowe climbed into the left seat and began the checklist sequence that would take them from cold aircraft to flight-ready status. Battery on, inverters on, fuel boost pumps on. The familiar progression of switches and procedures that her hands remembered even if her conscious mind had forgotten. The engine started with the reliable authority of well-maintained turboprops. Instruments came alive, presenting information in the green-tinted darkness of the cockpit. Kai's equipment racks hummed to life, filling the cabin with electronic presence. "Systems operational," Kai announced. "Data link established. Satellite communications active. Sensor packages responding normally. We're good to go on your call." Marlowe keyed the radio. "Kansas City Center, November 7-3 Tango X-ray, ready to taxi. 7-3 Tango X-ray, winds calm, altimeter 3015, cleared to taxi runway 27, departure frequency will be 124.1. She taxied into position, running through final checks, feeling the aircraft's weight and responsiveness. The King Air wanted to fly. She could feel it in the control pressures, the way the turboprops pulled against the brakes. "You ready?" Kai asked quietly. Marlowe advanced the throttles, feeling acceleration push her back into the seat, watching the airspeed indicator climb through rotation speed. She pulled back smoothly and the King Air lifted into darkness, climbing away from the only life she'd known for 9 years, heading towards something that would either redeem her or finish what Kandahar had started. "I was born ready," she said, and for the first time in a very long time she believed it. The initial climb was routine, almost boring. Marlowe leveled at 12,000 feet and trimmed the aircraft for cruise flight, following airways that would take them southeast toward Arkansas. Kansas City Center handed them off to Memphis Center, who acknowledged their fake flight plan and told them to maintain altitude and heading. All perfectly normal. All completely false. At the 40-minute mark, Kai's equipment came fully alive, displays showing what looked like real-time satellite imagery overlaid with data Marlowe didn't recognize. "Approaching first waypoint," Kai announced. "Start descent in 2 minutes. Target altitude 2,000 feet above terrain. Once we're below 10,000, we go dark. No radio except emergencies." Marlowe checked the terrain depiction on her moving map display. They'd be descending toward the Boston Mountains, following a valley system that wound through terrain that rose to 3,000 feet. 2,000 above ground meant 5,000 feet absolute altitude, low enough that terrain would be constantly present, close enough to see detail but far enough to provide some margin for error. Theoretically. "Beginning descent," she announced, reducing power and lowering the nose. The King Air responded immediately, trading altitude for airspeed in a controlled descent that took them through cloud layers and into the darker world below. At 9,000 feet, she leveled briefly, letting airspeed stabilize. Then continued down, watching the terrain rise up to meet them, feeling the familiar compression of altitude that made the Earth seem larger and more immediate. 5,000 feet, she called, 2,000 above terrain, leveling. Copy, Kai replied. Maintain heading 135, next turn in 7 minutes. The world outside the windscreen was almost completely dark. No cities down here, just scattered farms and the occasional small town. The Boston Mountains appeared as dark masses against a slightly less dark sky, their slopes and ridges visible only as absences of what little ambient light existed. Marlowe flew by instruments primarily, but kept glancing outside, maintaining the visual awareness that separated good pilots from ones who became NTSB statistics. The first turn came exactly on schedule, a 30-degree bank to the right that aligned them with a new valley. The terrain rose on both sides, constraining their options, forcing precision. A mistake here meant flying into a ridge line that would appear out of the darkness too late to avoid. Altitude, Kai said quietly. Marlowe checked. They'd climbed to 5,300 feet, 200 feet too high. She corrected immediately, lowering the nose slightly, bleeding off the excess altitude. 2,000 above terrain, she confirmed. Got distracted by the scenery. Don't, Kai said without inflection. This segment lasts 90 minutes. Lose focus and we die. Simple math. The flying settled into a rhythm of constant attention, small corrections, continuous monitoring. Turn, track, altitude, airspeed, terrain clearance, fuel remaining. The ancient pilot's scan that became automatic after enough hours, but required conscious effort after years away from complex operations. Marlowe's hands were steady on the controls, but her mind was working harder than it had in years. At the 1-hour mark, Kai spoke again. Next segment is the difficult one. We're following the Mulberry River through a canyon section. Minimum terrain clearance drops to 500 feet. Duration approximately 12 minutes. Navigation entirely by GPS and dead reckoning since there are no visual references. What's the width of the canyon? Variable. Narrows to less than a mile in sections. Marlowe felt her jaw tighten. 500 feet above terrain, in a canyon less than a mile wide at night with no visual references. This was the kind of flying that ended careers or lives, depending on whether you were lucky. We can scrub, she said. Climb out, go home, try again with better conditions. Conditions won't get better, Kai replied. This is as good as it gets. The people we're tracking are using this area specifically because normal surveillance can't reach it. Satellite passes are too infrequent. Ground sensors can't penetrate the forest. We're the only option that works, which is why you're getting paid $200,000 instead of flying fertilizer runs for $50 an hour. That's not encouraging. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true. Kai paused. I've flown this route 9 times with 3 different pilots. All of them got through it. You're more experienced than any of them. If you fly the instruments exactly as programmed, you'll be fine. Marlowe looked at the moving map display showing the canyon ahead. The terrain rose steeply on both sides, funneling them into a narrow corridor that twisted through the mountains like a geological argument. Beginning descent, she said, and pushed the nose forward. The King Air dropped toward the terrain in a controlled descent that felt uncomfortably aggressive. 4,000 feet, 3,000, 2,500. The radar altimeter came alive, showing actual height above ground. 2,000 feet, 1,500, 1,000. 500 feet above terrain, Marlowe called, leveling with more force than finesse. The radar altimeter showed 500 feet exactly, but the moving map showed terrain rising on both sides to peaks barely 1,000 feet above them. They were in a corridor now, committed, with no room for error and limited options for escape. Increase speed to 260 knots, Kai instructed. We need to clear this section before the next weather system moves in. Marlowe advanced the throttles, feeling the turboprops respond, watching airspeed build. 260 knots at 500 feet felt insane, but the numbers didn't lie and the aircraft didn't care about her anxiety. On speed, she confirmed. The canyon walls passed in darkness, invisible except as data on the terrain display. Marlowe flew pure instruments, trusting the GPS navigation and terrain database because there was literally nothing else to trust. Her peripheral vision caught movement outside the windscreen, probably trees rising close enough to see. But she forced her attention back to the instruments because looking outside would only confirm how close they were to terrain, and that information wouldn't help her fly better. "First turn coming up," Kai announced. 30 degrees left, roll out on heading 085. Marlowe initiated the turn, smooth and controlled, watching the heading indicator rotate. The radar altimeter fluctuated as terrain beneath them changed, 500 feet becoming 400 becoming 600, the ground rising and falling like geological waves. "Steady," Marlowe breathed, more to herself than Kai. She rolled out on the new heading and immediately began another correction as terrain rose ahead. The GPS navigation showed their flight path as a green line threading through digital mountains, their current position a small aircraft symbol tracking along that line with painful precision. Any deviation would put them into terrain that the database represented as red obstacles marked with elevation numbers that exceeded their current altitude. "Halfway through," Kai said quietly. "You're doing great. Hold this heading for 4 minutes, then we start the climb out." 4 minutes felt like 40. Marlowe's hands were light on the controls, making constant small inputs to maintain altitude and heading. Her scan rotated through instruments with metronomic regularity. Altitude, heading, airspeed, terrain clearance, altitude, heading, airspeed. Outside the windscreen, nothing but darkness and the occasional suggestion of terrain closer than it should be. Then Kai spoke again, urgency coloring the usually neutral tone. "Altitude warning, you're low." Marlowe's eyes snapped to the radar altimeter, 400 feet. She descended without noticing, distracted by heading corrections, losing situational awareness in the most dangerous possible moment. She pulled back on the yoke, adding power, climbing back to 500 feet. The radar altimeter stabilized. Her heart rate did not. "Sorry," she managed. "Focus," Kai replied. 2 minutes remaining. "Then we climb out and the hard part is over." The final 2 minutes were the longest of Marlowe's life. Every second felt like an opportunity to make the mistake that would put them into terrain, every instrument reading like a potential indication of imminent disaster. But the numbers held steady, the aircraft responded precisely, and when Kai finally said begin climb, unrestricted to 10,000 feet, Marlowe had never been more grateful to trade altitude for distance from the ground. The King Air climbed away from the canyon like it was fleeing a crime scene, clawing toward thinner air with the enthusiasm of an aircraft that understood how close it had come to becoming wreckage. At 10,000 feet, Marlowe leveled and reduced power, letting her breathing return to something approaching normal. "That was exciting," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "That was Tuesday," Kai replied. "We do this 3 times a week." "You're insane. We're paying you $200,000. "What does that make you?" Marlowe didn't have a good answer for that. She focused on flying the remaining segments, which felt almost easy after the canyon section. They completed 2 more low-altitude runs over different terrain, collecting whatever data Kai's equipment was recording, then began the transit back to Kansas. By the time they approached her runway, 3 hours and 40 minutes after departure, Marlowe felt more exhausted than she had after any mission in Afghanistan. The mental workload of precision flying in marginal conditions had burned through energy reserves she'd forgotten she possessed. She landed smoothly, taxied to the ramp, and shut down without ceremony. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Kai began powering down the equipment racks, securing systems, preparing for the long wait until the next mission. "You did well," Kai said finally. "Better than I expected for your first night back in complex flying. I almost killed us in the canyon." Almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. You corrected the error before it became dangerous. That's what matters. Marlowe climbed out of the cockpit on legs that felt less steady than they should. Dawn was breaking over the wheat fields, painting the sky in colors that reminded her why she'd started flying in the first place. The beauty of it, the perspective that came from altitude, the sense that being airborne was the only place where the world made sense. "When's the next mission?" she asked. 48 hours. Different route, same level of difficulty." Kai secured the cabin door and walked toward the black SUV that had appeared at some point during their flight. Get some rest. Practice your instrument scan. Maybe take the King Air up during daylight and reacquaint yourself with the handling characteristics. Next time we won't be so lucky with the weather. The SUV departed, leaving Marlowe alone with the aircraft and the sunrise and the strange new reality of being operational again. She walked back to the farmhouse, past the bank letters, through the kitchen where coffee cups accumulated like evidence of insomnia. In her bedroom, she set the widow helmet on the nightstand where she could see it. For 9 years, that call sign had represented failure, the end of everything she'd worked for. But maybe it actually represented survival, the ability to keep flying while everyone around her crashed. The stubborn refusal to quit even when quitting was the sensible option. Maybe being Cal.